Okay, Nelly, shoot. Go. All right, Nelly. Nelly, we ready. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, do it.
Welcome to Behind the News, right here from the village of Harlem on WGHCR Radio 99.9 on dial. This is Behind the News for liberation and political consciousness. But first, before we begin our program, the views and opinions stated in this broadcast does not represent that of management nor the Tenants Association of Grant Houses. And again, I'm your host and producer, Nellie Hester Bailey, and we welcome you to our program, Behind the News. Today, and I must let me just say, I've been away. I've had some personal family problems, death in the family, and I'm happy to be back here on the air. Now, we're going to concentrate today on housing that impacts everyone in this city, unless, of course, you are rich. And if you are, the government, public policy, and our elected officials are at your beck and call if you are rich. Even here in the gentrifying community of the village of Harlem, whether it's wealthy developers or institutions like Columbia University, those are the powers that be here in this city. Now, first, I'd just like to say I was listening intently with a special broadcast on WBAIO with Bob Law, whom I and others have been working with in terms of the deed theft of properties of people of color, in particular, Black New Yorkers. So first, I'd like to say a few things in terms of our understanding of housing and housing programs in this city are not and should not be lumped together. First of all, let's take a look at rent stabilization. And everyone, of course, is aware of the new rent regulations passed by the New York State legislature. And there were, in fact, some real rent reforms there. The moniker used by tenant activists and organizers, as well as non-for-profit housing group, is that this was universal rent control. Well, I have some issues with that because it's not universal rent control. It's not that at all. So let's take a look at some of the housing programs so we can make some distinctions, and that the housing stock and the housing policies and laws that are applicable to a certain housing stock as well as HPD programs are not the same. They are not the same. First of all, buildings under 5 units, and these generally are small homeowners. Well, these units are not, if they're 5 and under, are not subject to rent stabilization. Only those buildings with 6 and above are subject to rent stabilization. So let's look at these small property homeowners. And we're going to focus in particular on Black small homeowners. What triggers a visit from HPD code enforcement? And remember, these folks are renting to tenants. generally the small black homeowners certainly in no way are comparable or can be compared to that of the large real estate developers and landlords. There's no comparison whatsoever. None whatsoever. So you have this stock of small black homeowners. They have they have 5 units or less. They're not subject to rent stabilization, which means that they can charge whatever rent they want to, whatever their market will bear. So again, what triggers an HPD inspection, and the Harlem Tenant Council, when we were in business, we saw this all the time. So the HPD inspector, code enforcement comes out. Small landlords, these landlords oftentimes are barely holding on. They do not have the extra capital or revenue to invest as they should or in their buildings. And we know over time we see the deterioration of major systems, whether it's plumbing, the roof, windows, or whatever. And generally in these small buildings, you have families living, working class families who are trying to make a living. They can't afford the market rate, so they seek out the small landlords where they can rent an apartment, something that they can afford. So if the small homeowners do not have the capital or available revenue to maintain their property, if someone or one of the tenants called in code enforcement, there's a big problem. Because code enforcement will issue an order to correct. You got to do it. And if it's major systems and you're talking about a small building and upkeep and maintenance hasn't been done for years, whether it's the roof, the plumbing, and generally it's the plumbing. So code enforcement comes out and they might issue an order, well, you've got to put in new plumbing. You've got to put in a new roof. You have to upgrade the property so that it is in compliance with code enforcement. And if, as has been suggested, that HPD code enforcement is looking to take the property away from the small homeowner, then they have the perfect excuse. So they might embellish the violation. Well, you know, if it's this, well, I'll say it's this and this, because this is an opportunity for the city to seize this property and turn it over to some private developer. Now, one certainly cannot discount that theory. You simply cannot discount that theory. And more than likely, it is a combination of both. But the main thing is to get the property from the small black homeowner. Just as we have learned through complaints and reports, particularly in places like Bed-Stuy that are undergoing intense gentrification, where landlords and developers are in fact deliberately creating the conditions for violations to be issued against private homeowners. They may rent out a room or something like that, but generally it is these are private homeowners, and that is what has been happening, particularly with senior citizens, elderly homeowners. And it's no accident, but rather part of this scam that landlords are knocking on the doors of these private homes. And once they discover that the owner is an elderly person, and they come around knocking on the door, you want to sell your property? You want to sell your property? Because these landlords have done their research and they've looked up the property, and they have a pretty good idea of who's living there, whether or not it's an elderly person or not. And of course, they peruse the property tax payments, and that's another way that they hone in on the vulnerability of some of these homeowners. And so we have that. Now, we need to go back and look at the history. I want to know, is my favorite engineer, Doug Frazier, is there with me? I hope to hear some comments from him. Doug? Well, anyway,
yes, Nellie.
So now it's necessary to look at how did all of this start? Where does this come from? Because this is happening all over the country. And clearly, public policy, as it is designed today and even in the past, is to drive out working class Black people from municipalities that historically have been predominantly Black. Where did it all start? Where did it all start? Well, let's go back to the 60s. Let's go back to the time of Martin Luther King's assassination, when the cities were on fire, and the rebellion against the murder of King that was intrinsically linked to the racism and the public policy of poor housing and urban renewal that wiped out swaths of Black towns and communities. Pittsburgh is famous. And there was an author, she was a psychiatrist, Mindy Fullilove, who published her book a number of years ago on the urban renewal that devastated Black communities all over the country. All over the country, this is what urban renewal did. And Mindy Fullilove's book just slipped through my mind, and I will. Who, in an interview with Black sociologist Kenneth Clark, who coined the phrase urban Negro removal because of what was happening. And this was at the time under the Kennedy administration. So it's been in effect a very, very long time. Doug, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to know, let me know when you're ready to play the video piece that you were interested in letting the audience hear.
Oh, okay. So we reached back back into the archives of the Harlem Tenants Council and a housing conference that we organized 12 years ago. And the same problems exist today, only in some instances, it's even worse. At the time we held the housing conference, the homeless population in New York City was about 63,000. Today it is 68,000 people who on any given night in New York City are in the city's shelter system. And a great many, about a third or more, 40% of these of the population is in fact children of color. So let's go into one of these. Let's go into one of these video clips that Doug is going to play. Now, Doug, can you tell me which one it is so that I can give a little introduction?
Yeah, this is day 2.
Day 2, and who are you playing?
It's the gentleman and the lady.
Okay, well, let's start there and see what we have, and we'll go from there. So, can you start playing the video, please?
A prime victim of gentrification, I think, is a very, very complex issue. I'll give you an example. Housing Development Fund Corporation for low-income people. It comes out of the TIL program, tenant term lease program. The city wanted to give tenants an opportunity to purchase their apartments for $250. If the tenant association could show that they could manage the building and keep it, above, keep it profitable, or at least maintain it, then they would have this opportunity to purchase their apartments. These would be co-ops, and the co-ops, of course, have board of directors. Shareholders vote who's on the board. So now what we're seeing are what I'd like to call runaway boards. I'll give you an example. Not too far away from here, a board has decided to commence eviction proceedings against 10 families. Why? Because they're alleging that it's an eviction plan, and once the lease is up, they can evict. Now these of course are the HDFC. The theory behind this is to keep affordable housing in the community. So what these boards are doing is they're trying to evict low-income tenants and then sell the apartments for $75,000, even $100,000, in contravention of the spirit and indeed the letter of the law. So what we have, these 10 families, they commenced holdover proceedings in housing court. We were forced to start a Supreme Court action to stop the board from continuing to evict these families. We were successful in getting a stay, but it doesn't look good. And our argument was that, look, if you evict 10 families, 10 low-income families, the board can sell these apartments for perhaps $100,000. That's $1 million. And these apartments will go not to low-income people from the community, but to others who are coming in. The point is, you're taking away low-income housing from the community. We were successful in staying the proceeding. It's in the Supreme Court right now. We're not sure that we can win. The city's position was basically this, and this, I think, is a dirty little secret in our community. My clients are on welfare. Some of them are dysfunctional. Many, all of them, women with children. They have the right to stay in this community. They have every right to keep their apartments. You have boards who say, no, they're dysfunctional, they don't pay their rent on time, they're a problem, we don't want them. And I think it's wrong. These boards have to be controlled. These apartments are for low-income people. They're not for middle-class people or high-middle-class people. Now, this is the problem we have. Is it really gentrification if people of color who are middle class or high middle class come back to their community and purchase apartments or want to live in Harlem or East Harlem? I'm just presenting the question. I don't have an answer. And in coming in and purchasing these apartments, are they not contributing to gentrification? Now, I was born in the South Bronx, and I maintain that I have every right to go back to the South Bronx and live there, and perhaps, maybe, buy a co-op or rent an apartment that, is $1,500 a month, not that I can afford it. But these are issues that they're very complex issues. My point, or at least the Legal Aid Society's position, is that these apartments are for low-income people, and so what if people are wealthy? So it's a very emotional, very tough issue, because anyone, in my building anyway, in this situation, we're all people of color, we're all from the same neighborhood, we've been here 20, 30 years, and yet you have one part of the building saying, no, you have to go. And I think it's a class issue, and we have to be very aware that we have to maintain affordable housing for people, even if they're women with children, and they're on welfare. It does not make them pariahs. They should not be evicted. And if middle-class people don't want to live next to people on welfare, well, tough. And we have to continue to make sure that those who cannot protect themselves remain in this community. Now, something else I wanted to mention. DHCR. DHCR is the worst. They are so anti-tenant. It's just incredible. It was mentioned before. I think one of the how do you fight against gentrification? One of the things is to keep rents down. So people, you got to fight for every nickel increase. I mean, you have to fight to keep your rents as low as possible. MCI increases, major capital improvements. The state, the HCR, permits the owner to do some lousy work and then submit an application seeking permission to increase the rents. And there was a building in Washington Heights where the rents were, it was like $15 to $20 per room. And people simply cannot afford MCI increases. Yes, we want to live in habitable apartments. Yes, we want new gas lines, perhaps pointing. But I think landlords are milking the system. They are doing shoddy work and then submitting these applications for permission to increase the rents, and people simply cannot afford it. I'll give you an example. In Washington Heights, the rents went up by $200 to $200 a month. Now, it is true that these rents are phased in. You can't, you have to pay a maximum of 6% over a long period of time. But they're permanent increases, and I think it's landlords are using this MCI to increase the rents and make it less affordable for the tenants to live there, especially senior citizens. I represented the Dunbar. How many of you know the Dunbar?
Yeah.
The Dunbar is I think a great example of.
Now, folks, you just heard one of our guest speakers from the Housing Conference Archives of the Harlem Tenants Council. So we know that was happening 12 years ago, people being forced out of the Bronx. Now we know today the reverse trend that folks in Washington Heights, as it has become increasingly gentrified, have pushed people into the Bronx. And people are being pushed out of the Bronx now because of the unaffordable rents. But let's try to go back to the inception of all of this. Well, where is this all coming from? Let's go back to 1964 and the explosion of urban rebellions throughout the cities in the U.S. And the biggest spark of urban rebellion happened when Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1964. It swept through the country. The intensity and the seriousness of the rebellion, because governments weren't listening, and what generally set this off was the rampant and indiscriminate brutality of police departments, of the police, their brutality and murder, as it is today. So when things quieted down a little bit, and remember, National Guards were sent in. Some of the worst was in Detroit, Michigan, and you saw the brutality of those cops, the same or even worse than in the case of Rodney King. And so at the time, President Lyndon Johnson assumed the presidency after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And so President Johnson convened the Warner Commission to determine what went wrong. Why are these people rebelling? On the surface of it, it was so disingenuous. It was so Machiavellian that it's just amazing. Anyway, the Warner Commission came up with this report known as the Warner Commission Report. Chapter 11 or 13, I think is chapter 11, is most telling. The people whom Johnson assembled for this commission included the Army personnel, police chiefs from all over the country, military brass. It was unbelievable. So they came up with a soft sale that opened the Warner Commission that was in the opening statement. The society, the U.S. society, American society is moving toward two realities, separate and unequal. Now, that wasn't hard to figure out, but that's what they came up with. So what was the solution? Well, we have to do something about these folks. We have to do something. And what was hidden in this Machiavellian report was the true mission and aim of the government as designed by the Rand Corporation. And that is, the government had to seize control of the inner cities. They had to do that. Depopulation was the agenda. You got to get these black people out of these inner cities. It may take a long time, but we got to do it. We have to seize control of the cities and turn this around. Now, a couple of years later, and this is a really good example, in 1973, under the Beam administration, that implemented plan abandonment under the rubric of plan shrinkage, again, designed by the Rand Corporation. And essentially, it was a program of plan abandonment. And there were, at the time, social scientists and activists who talked about this plan abandonment of municipalities. Withdraw municipal services, reduce them drastically, so that the conditions would become increasingly worse the deterioration of the communities were inevitable because of the shrinking services. And then we know now that what was once dismissed as urban legend, the CIA didn't bring drugs into the communities of color, black communities from LA to New York, which is why we had the crack epidemic, was done deliberately to contribute toward the social decay in these neighborhoods. So planned shrinkage here in New York was one of reduced services. You reduce the police patrol, you reduce or drastically reduce sanitation pickup, you close schools, you close the subways, you did everything to make life virtually impossible, and this was on top of feeding drugs into the communities. And of course, if you have an epidemic of drugs, you have an epidemic of crime, and that's what they wanted. Now, the oligarchs of this country have the super rich, the elite, have always maintained since the turn of the century that poor people did not have the right to live on expensive real estate in the cities. They didn't have the right to do that. This was expensive real estate. It was for the rich and the super rich. So let's get back to planned shrinkage under the Beam administration. And this was at the time of the fiscal crisis in New York. Robert Fitch, a friend of mine who's no longer with us and who spoke at that housing conference, in his book, The Assassination of New York, lays it all out. It's a brilliantly researched book, heavily documented. At the time, under the Beam administration, Roger Starr was the housing commissioner. And Roger Starr, and I'm paraphrasing this, said, blacks and Latinos should leave the city. This is no longer an industrial city. They should leave and go back south or wherever they came from, but they should leave the city. His racist comments caused such consternation that he was fired. Beam was forced to fire him. Roger Starr didn't languish for one single day because he was quickly picked up by the New York Times, hired by the New York Times. And so we have the conditions that existed from Bed-Stuy to Harlem to the Bronx. Now, the Bronx was of particular interest for the lords of capital, and that later emerged as the growth engines in this city, euphemistically referred to as FIRE, finance, insurance, and real estate. So the decision, and that's why I wanted our listeners to hear, and we will do this next Saturday, to hear Rod and Deborah Wallace talked about how they made possible the fires in the Bronx. Fascinating story. Well, the Bronx burned down deliberately, false alarms or whatever. But the fact is, who collected on those burned buildings? The insurance companies. The insurance company. Part of this new growth engine. Because Starr's hypothesis was, hey, listen, This is no longer an industrialized city. We don't have an industrialized base. This is about finance, insurance, and real estate. And what did they do? They closed the ports. Now remember, New York City used to be a port city. It used to be a port city. It had jobs for working class people, working class Irish, working class Italians. It was a port city, but they closed it down. And so, but the black people didn't leave, particularly in Harlem. Where were people supposed to go? The black bourgeoisie fled because they had the economic means to move to the outer boroughs. But a lot of people stayed. They stayed through tough times, the crack epidemic, reduced services, planned shrinkage. They stayed. And so we progress into the Koch administration and the Giuliani administration and billionaire Bloomberg administration. And we have seen the steady decline of the black population throughout New York City. It became such a noticeable forced migration that it was recorded by the New York Times. And it wasn't just happening here. It was happening in all of the major, what were once industrialized cities, Chicago. It was happening all over. Pittsburgh, happening all over. And this takes us back to the Warner Commissioner report, because that was the plan. Plan abandonment, and simply put, after they've gone, you come back and you scoop up the property, and you do it through public policy. And this is what they have done. Now let's take some of these policies and examine them with close scrutiny. The third-party transfer, with close scrutiny, and an acknowledgement that this could not have been accomplished without the complicity of the black misleadership class. Under the Giuliani administration, Deborah Wright, whose father was a minister of a church in Brooklyn and who provided a haven for Giuliani when he was under intense criticism and attack for his racism, and who sought a venue through the black churches to show that he was not racist. And the father of Deborah Wright in Brooklyn accommodated Giuliani. As a result, Deborah Wright was appointed commissioner of HPD, housing commissioner of HPD. And under her tenure, she privatized the housing stock in New York City more so than any of her predecessors. That's what she did. Deborah Wright went on to become the president of the Upper Manhattan Empowerment Zone, and we know that that was a money trough for Harlem black politicians, headed by Congressman Charles Rangel. And the same Deborah Wright later became president of Carver Bank. And it was under her tutelage that Carver Bank loaned out $10 million in construction-related loans. It drove the bank into bankruptcy. And who came along? A white knight in shining armor was Wall Street. The banks of Wall Street that had been bailed out to the tune of trillions of dollars from the Obama administration. Trillions of dollars from the Obama administration. And so, Wright, because of her relationship with the oligarchs of New York City, had expected a bailout. But it didn't happen. And so the banks of Wall Street scooped up Carver, the oldest black bank in the nation. And I do believe the shareholders, the black shareholders, were left with less than 5% of the shares. Actually, I think it was about 2%. And to my utter amazement, the shareholders lamented about their poor Deborah Wright, who shortly thereafter left the bank. So that is the extent of the black misleadership class in Harlem. Under the Giuliani administration, Deborah Wright had introduced is a better word, the third-party transfer program, which allowed buildings and tax arrears, or whatever it generally was, tax arrears, water and sewage arrears, to be transferred to private landlords. That same policy was carried out by the de Blasio administration. And that's what people are fighting now. I see that we have about 10 or 15 minutes. I wish we could have some folks to call in, but let's continue with this narrative. Not unless you and Rick in the studio have some questions for me.
Well, I got one question, Nellie. Who did you say started the third-party transfer program again?
The third-party transfer was under the housing, the administration of the housing commissioner, Deborah Wright, an African-American woman who later on became head of the Upper Manhattan Empowerment Zone.
And you said she also ran Carver Bank into the ground? Ran Carver Bank?
I think your description is adequate. She ran it into the ground. Certainly the bank is no longer controlled by black shareholders. I can't think of a better description than the one that you just gave.
Now, the upper Harlem, whatever they call that, empowerment zone, can you name two things that they've done of significance?
Well, let's put it this way. When at the time, City Councilwoman Inez Dickens announced the rezoning of 125th Street over 73, I believe it may have been more than that. Harlem small black businesses shuttered their doors. They went under. Now, one would have assumed or hoped that it would have been the Upper Manhattan Empowerment Zone that would have stabilized those small black businesses, but they didn't. They didn't at all. And that's when corporate New York moved in with a vengeance on 125th Street. I can remember very well at that hearing, the city council vote, rather, not hearing, vote on the Upper Manhattan Empowerment Zone. No, the vote against the rezoning, of 125th Street. All of the politicians on the city council, with the exception of Charles Barron and who was his this guy who voted with Barron, who recently lost his seat in the New York State legislature. Only the two of them voted against the rezoning of 125th Street. Only two of them voted against the rezoning of 125th Street. And that was pivotal because it enabled Columbia University, with its $6 billion expansion, to move into West Harlem, complete control. And obviously their expansion will extend to and beyond 168th Street and Broadway, where Columbia University has its hospital. And that was
just for
yes.
a point of clarification, the video that we played earlier was exactly Rod and Ford, whatever the name you used, it was actually them. That was the right one, just technically speaking. And number two.
Oh, okay.
So number two, we can play it, and I'll have it ready for the next episode of Behind the News with Miss Nellie Bailey, which was also being now broadcast live over our YouTube channel. But my question was, since you brought up the Columbia $6 million,
it's $6 billion expansion. $6 billion, not million.
Now, are they in terms of landholders in New York City? What is their status? Do you know?
Columbia University has a number of dummy corporations that buys up properties throughout Harlem. So prevalent was their greed and speculation in Harlem. Many believe that Columbia University had its eyes on public housing closest to its campus, and that would be Grant houses and Manhattanville housing.
Now, where right now we're broadcasting out of Grant houses right now, as we speak. I just wanted to make that clarity. So you were saying Columbia wanted to take.
Yeah, but I think it's I think it failed. Well, because it's not easy. Grant houses as well as Manhattanville are subsidized with both public funds, city, state, and federal funds. So that's one thing. What the Obama administration did was to work out a deal with developers that if they came in and these public housing has been riddled with scandalous accusations, I'll say that, allegations of corruption. And so one of the proposals to stabilize public housing was a combination of public and private funds, which may have been a good plan or a strategy, but it clearly has not worked. And it is the innovation of the tenants themselves who are making a difference. But I don't want to dwell on that so much as Columbia University and the fact that all of the elected officials in Harlem supported the expansion, with the exception, I must say, I believe, of Bill Perkins. Now, I was part of a coalition group that fought against Columbia University's expansion for years. We took them to court. We had a coalition with the business owners in the expansion site, and that was a number of folks. I mean, we had some success in that. The Floridita was one of our successes. Because every attempt was made to drive Floriditas out of business. Nick Spray-Reagan, who was the owner of a storage company, held out for a long time, and it's only recently that the late Nick Spray-Reagan's father sold his storage company. And so Columbia University was able to solidify its hold over a large swath of land to accommodate their expansion. Now, one of the things that we talked about, and very few people discuss it today, and it was serious enough that a scientist from Columbia University wrote an article in the now defunct Village Voice that the bathtub which is a structure underneath the building that Columbia University wanted to experiment with dangerous pathogens transported to that site might face, and the community, serious consequences because of the rise in sea levels that might possibly cause a flood, and that would produce a major catastrophe that with these dangerous pathogens afloat or not being contained, that might prove deadly. And that's something else that we should talk about possibly next week.
Okay.
And I see that we are nearing the end of our time here. So I just want to say quickly that we will pick up this story next week, and we will look at, we will have an analysis of the national landscape in terms of blacks being forced out of these major once industrial areas. A lot of folks are returning to the South, and I don't think that is a glorious haven, and it is all that it is hyped up to be yes, the cost of living is less, but so is the pay grade. You know. So again, I want to thank everyone for tuning in to Behind the News for liberation and political consciousness. I'm your host, Nellie Hester Bailey. He not in the studio, but then broadcast from another site that we have been voiced in by our wonderful engineer, Doug Frazier. I will be in the studio next week. And again, thank everyone for listening. And as usual, many thanks to our engineer, Doug Frazier. We thank you so much for listening to our program today.
Okay, thank you, Nellie. And we're going to be taking a quick break. And, then we're going to continue in the venue, as what's they used to say, with Mr. Rick Motivation Young.